When Jerome Walker stepped out from the edge of the forest near the town of Phelps in July 2019, he was barely recognizable, gaunt, staggering, his skin covered in deep gouges that looked like they'd been carved with red-hot steel. The man had gone missing 16 months earlier on a deserted stretch of road in Appalachia, where every search effort had failed and he was presumed dead. But the most terrifying thing wasn't his ravaged appearance. The most terrifying thing was what he said about those 16 months, about the person who had held him captive, and about the others who might still be out there somewhere, in the darkness of the abandoned mines. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the evening of March 6, 2018, the gravel parking lot of the Matewan Gas and Go station along the Appalachian Mountain Road was shrouded in cold mist, eerily quiet as Jerome Walker's truck rolled into the faint golden light around the storefront windows. Finishing the long haul, he'd been driving non-stop from Charleston. Jerome, a 42-year-old driver accustomed to remote routes, stopped as usual, grabbed a hot coffee, checked his delivery schedule again, and took a few minutes to rest before tackling the dangerous winding roads into Kentucky. Security footage captured him closing the cab door, pulling his jacket tight against the wind, then walking into the convenience store looking tired but steady, showing no signs of unease. But according to what was later confirmed from the camera data, that normalcy lasted only a few minutes. When Jerome left the store, coffee cup in hand and head down checking notifications on his phone, an old rusty-colored Chevy Silverado pulled into the lot at a slow pace, its headlights cutting two dim beams through the fog. The man driving that truck stepped out, slammed the door hard to steady himself on the damp gravel, then moved straight toward Jerome with clear intent. The camera only captured the upper half of his body and the movement of the rusty vehicle. But the entire approach between the two men took place fully in a complete blind spot at the western corner of the lot, where the overhang light didn't reach. The next frame the camera recorded was an empty parking lot. Jerome never reappeared at the store, nor did he return to his truck cab to continue the trip as planned. His truck remained parked in its original spot, unmoved, with no sign of preparing to leave. This anomaly went unnoticed at first, but by 10:30 p.m. that night, Jerome's ex-wife began to worry when her calls went straight to voicemail. Repeated calls with no answer prompted her to immediately contact the trucking company to check his route by around 2:10 a.m. On March 7th, the company's monitoring system recorded the truck's GPS signal, sitting stationary at a point completely off the route. Jerome was supposed to be on a strange coordinate many miles from the gas station and not part of any delivery. Location. The prolonged loss of contact, combined with the unchanged location signal for hours, shifted the family from worry to serious alarm. After a sleepless night with no news, at 6:40 a.m., Jerome's family officially reported him missing to the Mingo County Sheriff's Office, marking the opening of a missing persons case, and making Jerome Walker the subject of an urgent search in a highly unusual disappearance in the Appalachian Mountains. Right on the day Jerome Walker was reported missing, the Mingo County rescue teams coordinated with state police to organize a search in the mountainous and forested areas around Red Jacket Mountain, where the steep, rolling terrain was covered in thick, dense forest that severely limited visibility. Geological maps of the region showed more than a dozen old trail branches, most of them already overgrown with dirt, rocks, and tree roots, forcing the search teams to split into multiple groups moving in different directions to ensure no potential spot where human traces might appear was overlooked. One team was assigned to survey the eastern area, where the slopes were lower and more accessible with signal-emitting equipment. Another team headed west, where the terrain was more complex, with numerous rock crevices and steep drops, requiring the search to proceed slowly and cautiously. The remaining teams expanded northward, where there were once abandoned logging trails, many years old, narrow, slippery paths covered in thick layers of decaying leaves that made moving in formation extremely difficult. The K-9 unit was deployed to conduct scent tracking based on a sample from Jerome's jacket, following a natural opening that led deep into the woods. At first, the scent trail was quite clear, stretching nearly a mile across soft ground, looping around large tree roots, and approaching a low ridge. Near the northern edge of the forest at Red Jacket Mountain, where the wind was stronger and the air more humid, the canine lost the ability to orient, due to the scent becoming diluted and scattered. The handler noted the point where the trail was lost as a key marker, logged it with GPS, and placed colored flags so other teams could continue surveying with specialized equipment, recording humidity levels and wind speed to assess the impact of weather on scent tracking. While ground teams continued combing the forest branches, a helicopter was deployed to sweep the valley along the Tug Fork River, using infrared cameras to detect any temperature anomalies that might indicate human presence. The helicopter pilot conducted multiple sweeps along the same flight path, repeating in the opposite direction to rule out missing small objects amid the dense forest patches. Observations included riverside rock piles, deep crevices in the mountain walls, and any unusual clearings that could serve as temporary shelters. All data collected was transmitted live to the temporary command center, where technicians analyzed every frame for any movement or unusual signs. The results showed no activity across the entire valley corresponding to Jerome's presence, or a lone man moving through the area. Police also requested home security camera footage from residents around the town of Matewan, while collecting video from stores, service stations, and intersections within many miles. All footage was reviewed frame by frame in the relevant time windows, with special attention to vehicles leaving Matewan after the time Jerome appeared at the gas station. No video captured anyone matching the description, or Jerome's truck appearing on the roads connecting the town to Red Jacket Mountain, or any side roads leading into the forest. Traffic checks were expanded to smaller back roads, leading to sparsely populated areas and abandoned mining sites, where inspection teams looked for brake marks, tire skids, bent metal frames, barrier debris, or any signs indicating the vehicle had been blocked or forced to stop. The long stretches south and southeast were surveyed using cameras mounted on handheld pull devices, recording soil depressions and any unusual small ruts on the gravel surface. Old wooden bridges, which posed collapse risks, or could leave distinctive marks if a truck crossed them, were inspected multiple times with remaining load-measuring equipment and extended pole-mounted cameras to reach hard-to-see spots. Not a single one of these points revealed any signs of an accident or forced stop. Many ground search teams continued expanding in concentric circles, marking each position with GPS coordinates and colored wooden stakes to avoid duplication during surveys. Analysis of disturbed soil layers, determining the thickness of decaying leaf cover, and recording unusual impressions in the ground yielded no results related to human activity within the time frame set by the search teams. Cross-referencing all the data showed no evidence pinpointing Jerome's direction of travel after he entered the blind spot of the Matewan gas station parking lot, nor any basis to identify any road, trail, or forest area that could have led him away from town. The entire initial search campaign over those first days revealed only one clear reality. There were no direct traces whatsoever to explain Jerome's disappearance, or to determine the direction he moved after leaving camera view, leaving every effort to locate him without any solid investigative anchor. 3 days after the search teams had combed the entire old-growth forest area around Red Jacket Mountain without obtaining any reliable clues, a Mingo County Forest Patrol group discovered Jerome Walker's truck sitting silently in a narrow clearing right at the forest's edge along the Tug Fork River, about 11 miles as the crow flies from the Matewan Gas and Go station. The area was almost never visited by people. It was merely a flat patch formed by years of riverbank erosion and deep tree roots extending into the soil, creating a narrow space just wide enough for a truck to park without drawing attention. The patrol team noted that the truck was positioned right next to a small trail leading down close to the Tug Fork River's waterline, with the front wheels angled toward the forest, and the rear wheels about 20 meters from the main trail, as if the vehicle had been deliberately maneuvered into place, not slid, plunged, or forced there abnormally. The surrounding ground was still soft from prior rainfall, but there were no signs of sudden braking, drag marks, or aggressive soil disturbance, indicating the vehicle had been brought there by force or driven in a loss-of-control state. When the investigation team approached the cab, the door was unlocked, the handle showed no scratches or bending, and the door frame had no signs of being pried. Inside the cab, the driver's seat was still adjusted to the familiar position, matching Jerome's build according to trucking company data. Personal items such as a light jacket, gloves, logbook, and a half-full water bottle remained neatly in their usual places. In the cup holder, the coffee cup was completely cold but hadn't spilled, indicating the cab had not experienced any sudden impact or unexpected disruption. The vehicle's GPS device was still powered on, but the map froze exactly at the moment the signal went stationary in the early morning hours of March 7th, displaying no additional route after that time. Both the cab and the surrounding area showed absolutely no signs of a struggle. The seatbelt wasn't yanked taut, the windows weren't cracked, the dashboard wasn't struck hard, the radio was off, the keys were not in the ignition but also not on the floor or in any easily visible spot. The fact that the truck was parked in a relatively orderly position, not crashed into a tree, not tilted close to the riverbank, and not caught on any obstacle, led the investigation team to assess that the vehicle was most likely driven there by a conscious person, rather than a panicked victim or someone lacking skill. However, every other factor gave no indication that Jerome had left the truck under his own power, because the ground directly under the cab door showed absolutely no footprints, neither fresh shoe prints nor hastily erased old ones. The layer of decaying leaves and dry branches remained completely undisturbed, not displaced in the typical way someone would step down from a cab. The investigation team shifted focus to searching for traces of an assisting vehicle, but this yielded no results. There were no tire tracks other than those of the truck itself, no impressions from a motorcycle or small off-road vehicle, and no drag marks or leaking oil indicating another vehicle had entered or left the area. Investigators continued ground searches around the truck in a 500-meter radius, divided into 3 directions: down toward the riverbank, up the slope back to the main trail, and along the small trail running parallel to the river. The path down to the riverbank was very narrow and slippery, with a thin layer of mud over the rocks, but there were absolutely no shoe impressions or signs of anything heavy sliding down. The uphill area also showed no disturbance of soil or decaying leaf cover. The direction along the river was checked by inspecting tree roots, rock crevices, and natural hiding spots, but no items, scraps of fabric, broken branches, or any human signs were found. Metal detectors were deployed to locate any dropped metal objects, but the signals received were mostly natural minerals, with no suspicious items. UV light ground checks also failed to identify blood traces or drag marks. The official report sent to the command center highlighted the striking contradiction. A truck parked in what appeared to be a calm manner, yet no signs of the driver leaving the vehicle, and no traces of anyone else being present at the scene. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation team expanded searches several miles along old trail branches, rock hollows, and spots once used by locals to shelter from rain, but still found no signs related to Jerome or any possible journey after the truck appeared at this location. Every suspicious point was marked, GPS located, and photographed in detail, but ultimately ruled out because none matched any pattern of behavior from someone moving in a panicked state or trying to find shelter. When all reasonable possibilities had been eliminated, the investigation had no basis to expand the search in new directions. By the end of April 2018, the entire case file was transferred to cold case status WV201834, noting the matter temporarily suspended due to a lack of direct evidence and inability to determine the victim's direction of travel. Jerome's family, after many weeks of attempting to organize independent searches, was also forced to stop their efforts due to no clear direction remaining, while the trucking company ended its search support because no additional clues emerged, indicating Jerome had moved away from the location where the truck was found. On the morning of July 12, 2019, in the sprawling forest behind the small residential area of Phelps, a local resident was checking the fence behind his house when he spotted a man emerging at the edge of the tree line, staggering as though he had traveled a very long distance without enough strength left to maintain balance. The initial distance of about 50 meters made the resident think it was just a hiker having physical trouble. But as the man came closer, his utterly collapsed state became shockingly clear. His body emaciated, shoulders hunched forward as if weighed down by months of malnutrition, long tangled hair, uneven beard growth, deeply sunken eyes, and a face dazed from utter exhaustion. When the resident approached to help, he immediately noticed the strange scar streaks running along both arms and up onto the man's chest. These weren't random scars, but deliberate characters carved with a sharp object, arranged in vertical rows with varying degrees of damage, some healed over, some still oozing fresh blood, indicating a repeated behavior over a long period. The man walked with a reluctant gait, each step lacking strength and balance. Bare feet caked in river mud and forest dirt, clothes torn to the point of no longer retaining their original shape. When asked if he was okay, he didn't respond clearly, only managing a few broken syllables like someone who had lost the ability to speak for a long time. His voice hoarse and breathing labored. The resident immediately called emergency services upon recognizing the severe state of depletion. Pallid skin, weak pulse, constant full-body trembling, and multiple old scars mixed with fresh bruising on his back, signs reflecting a prolonged period of restricted nutrition, sleep deprivation, and possible captivity. When medical personnel arrived, they noted a strong body odor, signs of extended dehydration, and slow response to auditory stimuli. The man was rushed to the small hospital in Phelps, where the medical team provided initial emergency care by administering IV fluids, checking cardiovascular status, measuring oxygen levels, and cleaning the skin wounds. When asked his name, he only whispered two unclear syllables, forcing the hospital to take fingerprints for identification. The identification system immediately returned a match. Jerome Walker, the truck driver reported missing since March 2018 in West Virginia. The doctors, after reviewing the file, realized the skeletal man lying in the hospital bed was the person who had vanished without a trace for over a year. They conducted a closer examination of the carved characters and noted these were intentional wounds, showing clear repetition in placement and carving style, completely unlike the result of an accident or random contact with sharp objects. Some healed scars indicated the perpetrator had repeatedly returned to damage old skin areas or create new ones in a symbolic pattern. The identification information was immediately forwarded to investigative agencies in West Virginia and Kentucky, and the hospital sent a preliminary medical report to both states due to the unusual nature of the injuries, especially the signs that Jerome had been deprived of freedom over an extended period. Local police officers stationed at the hospital documented the current condition in detail, describing Jerome's unstable mental state. He reacted with fear to the sound of a metal door closing, startled violently when someone entered the room quickly, and his eyes constantly scanned around as if searching for an escape route. Medical staff assessed this as evidence of prolonged stress and a heightened state of hypervigilance commonly seen in long-term captivity victims. Once full identification was confirmed, the investigating agency promptly updated the missing persons file and recorded the event as a major turning point. The reappearance of someone presumed missing, under unclear circumstances, in a state of extreme depletion with deliberate injuries, forced authorities to treat this as an indicator of deprivation of liberty, systematic infliction of harm, and potential connection to an organized criminal pattern. Every initial description from the medical report reinforced this assessment. Wounds of varying ages, severe physical wasting, mental instability, signs of exhaustion from prolonged forced labor, and the intentionally carved characters on the skin rather than self-inflicted. Right on the day Jerome's identity was confirmed, the case was reopened under the direction of investigating confinement, torture, and victim handling according to a pattern of coercion. His appearance in Phelps in a near-total state of collapse led authorities to determine this was not a simple missing persons case, but a complex one, involving an organized sequence of actions lasting more than 16 months, requiring the entire file to be restored for investigation under a more serious criminal framework. When the medical team at the small hospital in Phelps began assessing Jerome Walker's physical condition, they quickly realized the level of emaciation far exceeded the initial description from emergency personnel, with his weight having dropped to a dangerous level compared to his 2018 health records kept by the trucking company. Major muscle groups in his shoulders, back, and legs visibly atrophied. Muscle response during stretch reflex testing weakened to about 1/3 of normal strength. Subcutaneous fat had almost completely disappeared. Ribs, collarbones, and both hips prominently visible, reflecting a prolonged period of malnutrition, possibly many consecutive months without adequate energy intake. Blood tests showed low albumin levels, severe micronutrient deficiencies, iron deficiency, and electrolyte imbalances, accompanied by signs of dehydration, causing cracked, dry skin, and a deep cold sensation, despite stable body temperature. On Jerome's wrists and ankles, doctors discovered circular patterned scars, with skin compressed over long periods leading to discoloration and deep indentations as if caused by rope, electrical cord, or metal restraints. The subcutaneous tissue beneath the scars had thickened abnormally, indicating he had been bound for an extended time or had his limbs fixed in a position for heavy labor. Some areas around the ankles and wrists showed small burns, round or elongated in shape, possibly from hot metal objects or heat-conducting surfaces, creating a series of injuries impossible to mistake for household accidents. In addition, widespread old bruising across the shoulders, back, and both sides of the ribcage reflected repeated forceful impacts, possibly in the context of forced carrying or beatings for non-compliance. Doctors paid particular attention to the system of carved characters extending across Jerome's chest, abdomen, back, and both arms. Some had fully scarred over, flat and faded, while others remained bright red or still seeping blood, clearly showing formation in multiple distinct stages. The presence of overlapping layers of injuries proved the captivity was not short-term but a process lasting many months with a deliberate sequence of targeted harm, bearing marks of branding and control. The deepest carvings on the chest and back had even developed mild tissue calcification, meaning they had existed long enough for the body to begin a repair response, while the fresher wounds on the arms and hips were still rough and swollen at the edges, indicating the injurious behavior had continued right up until his escape. During full-body X-rays, the medical team discovered two misaligned healed fractures on Jerome's right 7th and 8th ribs, with the degree of bone union indicating the injury occurred several months earlier, not a recent incident. The fractures had not healed straight but were offset to one side, reflecting strong forceful impact on the bone, possibly from being struck with a hard object or forced into heavy labor beyond endurance. This misalignment, untreated properly, resulted in restricted torso rotation and pain on deep inhalation. Hand X-rays also revealed acute repetitive strain arthritis, especially in the middle finger joints and wrists. Soft tissues around the hands had thickened and calloused, typical of individuals subjected to forced labor in cold environments without protective gear. The consulting psychologist's report noted that Jerome exhibited intense panic reactions to the sound of a metal door closing, rapid pupil dilation, sudden spike in heart rate, and full-body trembling, classic signs of a conditioned reflex formed during prolonged control and threat in confined spaces. When medical staff accidentally dropped a metal tray of instruments, Jerome instinctively curled up and covered his head with his arms in a defensive reflex, behavior commonly seen in victims repeatedly beaten with hard objects. Specialized tests recorded avoidance of eye contact, excessive vigilance toward others' movements, and constant startled responses to unexpected noises. All of these were textbook signs of severe PTSD, developed in the context of repeated deprivation of liberty, physical and psychological threats, and an unstable living environment. Doctors concluded that beyond physical emaciation, Jerome's psychological trauma was severe enough to directly impair his ability to describe events and achieve long-term recovery. Dermatological endoscopy results showed the carved letter wounds were not caused by an accidental sharp object, but by a small, sharp, slightly heated blade producing uniform cuts, indicating the perpetrator had skill and intent. The number of carvings, their depth, and the way wounds were created in straight lines or arcs across the body pointed to a ritualistic pattern of torture rather than impulsive acts. Darkened, dry, and flaking multi-layered skin, brittle hair loss, and thickened nail keratin indicated Jerome had lived in an environment lacking natural light and adequate hygiene, conditions typical of enclosed spaces, like storage areas, mines, or makeshift holding cells. Abnormal callus thickness on the feet reflected frequent walking on rough ground without protective footwear, while impact bruises on the knees and shins proved repeated collisions with hard objects in confined spaces. Synthesizing all medical data, including blood tests, X-ray analysis, psychological observations, and external injury assessments, the specialist team concluded that Jerome had endured a prolonged period of captivity, nutritional restriction, forced labor in a harsh and light-deprived environment, and systematic forms of punishment and torture. The evidence on his body demonstrated the existence of a detention process, a repeated form of control applied consistently, causing not only direct physical harm but also profound psychological devastation, leaving clear signs of isolation from normal environments throughout the 16 months. As soon as the West Virginia Investigative Agency received confirmation of Jerome Walker's identity at the hospital in Phelps and recognized the injury patterns indicating a high likelihood that he had been held captive for an extended period, the forensic team was ordered to unseal the truck, previously discovered 11 miles from the Matewan Gas and Go station, in order to re-examine the entire vehicle from the perspective of a criminal case rather than a simple missing persons incident. The truck was transported to the Mingo County Evidence Storage Facility, placed on a fixed frame to prevent disturbance of traces, and then both the cab and the cargo bed were separated according to standard procedure. When the seals were removed, the forensic group noted numerous traces that had not appeared in the initial examination report. On the passenger side floor mat inside the cab, where only ordinary dirt was expected, a segment of black zip tie was found stretched to the breaking point, with scorched plastic edges as if it had snapped under excessive tension. Beneath the driver's seat, technicians discovered a gray rubber glove wedged in a plastic seam, its surface still retaining a familiar chemical odor associated with industrial facilities, unlike any solution Jerome reportedly used according to trucking company records. In the rear cargo bed, an auxiliary tow hook had been detached and shifted to one side, with the securing bolts twisted in a manner indicating mechanical force rather than proper tool removal, proving someone had tampered with the bed structure after Jerome disappeared. When the forensic team applied magnetic powder and low-angle lighting, a series of faint shoe prints covered in gray-black coal dust appeared on the cab's step-up. Preliminary analysis showed the coal dust particles were very fine, tending to lodge in shoe treads in the manner typical of dust from abandoned coal mines in the Appalachian range, where dozens of large and small mining operations had been shut down over the past 2 decades. Samples of the dust were collected with specialized adhesive tape, sealed, and sent to the Mineral Analysis Lab for comparison against a database of more than 20 coal mines within the standard radius. These shoe prints did not match Jerome's footwear based on measurements provided by the trucking company, nor were they the type of work boots he used daily. Technicians also noted deeper impressions in the section closest to the door, suggesting the wearer of those shoes had stood in the same spot multiple times to climb into the cab or to observe something inside. This made the hypothesis that the truck had been used by an outsider far more concrete. In addition, the forensic team re-examined the steering wheel, dashboard, and other high-contact surfaces. Fingerprint data recovered showed numerous prints not belonging to Jerome, though most were smudged or overlapping, preventing immediate identification. Nevertheless, the large quantity of unidentified fingerprints proved the cab had been used or accessed multiple times during the period after the truck was found. An inconsistency with the original scene that showed no obvious signs of forced entry. A closer inspection of the floor under the passenger footwell revealed a small fragment of coarse fabric mixed with reddish-brown soil, a type of earth that did not match the soil at the truck's discovery location, but resembled mineral-mixed dirt commonly found at abandoned extraction sites in the Appalachian region. Combined with the coal dust on the step-up, the investigation team concluded the truck had been taken over by someone to travel to or through a mining area before being abandoned at the forest edge. The rear bed also contained fresh scratch marks on the metal walls that were absent from initial scene photographs. These scratches were positioned low enough to have been caused by a heavy object being dragged in or out. Yet no items remained in the bed to explain their origin. Analysis of wear patterns on the detached tow hook bolts showed they had been forcefully rotated counterclockwise in a hurried manner, most likely with improvised tools such as pliers or a steel pipe, rather than professional driver tools. These pieces of evidence completely ruled out the possibility that Jerome himself had driven the truck away from the gas station area. Given the state of extreme depletion in which he was found, Jerome could not have performed operations such as detaching the tow hook or left behind a series of shoe prints not belonging to him. Moreover, both cab and bed clearly showed the presence of one or more individuals other than Jerome. Examination of the vehicle's electrical system revealed that the ignition and starter locks had not been tampered with, meaning the person who took control likely used Jerome's keys or forced him to surrender them before he went missing. Collectively, the zip tie remnants, the chemically scented glove, the coal dust shoe prints, and the deformed bolts formed the basis for proving the vehicle had been exploited by someone else during the time Jerome lost contact. The presence of coal dust and coarse fabric bearing Appalachian mineral characteristics became the first element linking the case to the context of abandoned mines, opening the hypothesis that whoever controlled the truck had operated in or moved through those remote, hard-to-access old extraction sites. When Jerome Walker was alert enough to describe what happened at the Matewan Gas and Go station on the evening of March 6, 2018, he said the opening moment of his disappearance unfolded in such ordinary circumstances that it was impossible to imagine it would become the starting point for a prolonged captivity. According to him, after leaving the convenience store with a hot cup of coffee, he headed straight toward his truck cab when an old rusty-colored Chevy Silverado pulled up close and stopped right at the edge of the parking lot, slightly angled toward the rear exit of the gas station. The man who stepped out of that vehicle immediately directed his gaze toward Jerome and called out to him in a hoarse but friendly voice, saying his truck had just died on the forested slope behind the station and he needed an experienced driver to take a quick look and see if it could be restarted. Jerome stated that this kind of request for help was not unusual for long-haul drivers like him. Assisting someone stranded in the middle of the night was completely in line with the mutual aid culture among truckers, especially in remote areas like Appalachia. What made him trust the man was the way he demonstrated knowledge about pickup trucks, specifically mentioning an unusual clunk sound when cranking the engine on that sloped section, which matched issues Jerome had heard about with older Silverado models. He described the perpetrator as not appearing rushed or avoiding the light. Instead, he stood quite relaxed while talking, shielding the lower part of his face under a baseball cap, speaking in a voice with the familiar mountain region accent Jerome had grown accustomed to after years of hauling freight across Appalachia. Jerome recounted that the man led him around to the back of the station, where the darkness and dense trees prevented any camera coverage. When they arrived, the Silverado was parked at a slight angle, its front facing up a dirt path leading into the woods. Jerome stepped over to open the hood while the man stood right behind him, pretending to shine a light with his phone. He bent down to check the spark plugs and air filter box, noticing nothing out of the ordinary. While he reached deeper inside to inspect the fuel injection system, the man stepped closer and said, "I think I smell gas coming from underneath," prompting Jerome to adjust his position to get a better look at the lower engine area. That exact moment, according to him, a cloth was suddenly pressed tightly over his nose and mouth from behind. Jerome tried to jerk away, but the hand clamped down with incredible strength. His breathing immediately became heavy and hot, a sharp, acrid smell shooting straight into his sinuses and making his head spin. He realized this wasn't the smell of gasoline or motor oil, but the odor of an anesthetic substance that caused his vision to blur and his body to stiffen. He said that within just a few seconds, all strength drained from him. His legs could no longer hold balance, and he collapsed forward but was caught by the man to prevent a hard impact. His ears rang, surrounding sounds turned into distant echoes, and the last image he remembered was the Silverado, with its silver paint peeling in patches on the hood. The next thing Jerome became aware of was the sensation of his body being dragged, his hands scraping along the ground as if pulled with great force. He heard a metal vehicle door open, heard the hinges creak, then felt the cold, rough surface of a truck seat press against his cheek. His body was shoved into the backseat row, face down, a musty smell mixed with motor oil filling the air and making it hard to breathe. He felt the moment his wrists were yanked behind his back and zip ties cinched tight, sending sharp pain radiating from his wrists up to his shoulders. The Silverado started up right after that, its distinctive gruff old engine sound vibrating strongly through the floor. In a half-conscious state, Jerome felt the truck travel over rough sections, sometimes tilting sharply to the left, as if crossing tree roots or dirt mounds, then speeding up on flatter stretches. He described the journey as lasting so long that he could no longer distinguish main roads from forest paths. Only the sound of gravel kicking up under the chassis and wind whipping past the windows indicated the vehicle was heading deep into sparsely populated territory. When he first opened his eyes after that sequence of movement, he saw no overhead lights or street lamps, only thick darkness. He felt enveloping cold and dampness in a confined space. Both wrists throbbed painfully from the tight bindings, and his eyes could make out nothing around him except the dark outline of a nearby wall. He tried to turn, but the space was too narrow, barely enough to kneel or sit with knees drawn up. The sensation of hard, cold ground, faintly carrying the smell of rotted coal and old metal rising from all around, made him realize this was not a vehicle compartment or any ordinary room. The fact that he awoke bound, unable to orient himself, along with the feeling of faint wind whistling through an overhead crack, indicated he had been brought to a secluded, isolated location with natural soundproofing. Jerome's account of how the perpetrator approached, using the pretext of a dead truck and exploiting the reflexive helpfulness of fellow truckers to anesthetize him, provided crucial evidence proving the ambush was carefully premeditated. He knew Jerome would trust another driver, knew how to lead him into a camera blind spot, and simulated an engine failure convincingly enough to make him bend down and inspect, creating the perfect posture for applying an ether-soaked cloth. The entire description of the sequence of events leading to his being drugged and removed from the gas station showed this was not a spontaneous act, but one based on observation, target selection, and preparation of tools, vehicles, and escape routes designed to conceal traces. Based on Jerome Walker's initial statement, and the traces collected from the truck bearing characteristic coal dust from abandoned mining sites in the Appalachian region, the investigative team began building a profile of a perpetrator operating according to an organized criminal pattern. Nicknamed Rustler, due to his habit of hijacking truck cargo and exploiting victims' labor. Information about the man who approached Jerome at the Matewan Gas and Go station showed that his method of operation relied on a deep understanding of long-haul drivers' typical behavior, their willingness to help someone in distress, especially at night, on remote routes along the Appalachian mountain range. Exploiting this instinct for mutual aid allowed him to approach victims naturally, without raising suspicion, thereby creating the opportunity to anesthetize, subdue, and remove the victim from areas covered by surveillance cameras. Based on the number of binding scar wounds, the layers of carvings at different stages of healing, and Jerome's physical condition, investigators determined that Rustler's motive went beyond simply stealing cargo from trucks. It also included using the drivers themselves as sources of forced labor in scattered abandoned coal mines along the West Virginia-Kentucky border. These mines had been left vacant for many years, with degraded infrastructure, no ongoing management, and deep underground sections ideal for covert confinement, creating a perfect environment for him to force victims into unpaid labor under strict control. Traces on Jerome showed he employed multiple layers of violence to maintain power, not just through binding or beatings, but also through the act of carving characters into the skin as a method of marking ownership. The progressive carving over time, with varying degrees of scar healing, reflected a systematic pattern of torture intended to destroy the victim's spirit and reinforce control, turning the victim into a completely dependent subject. This behavior was not impulsive, but demonstrated repetition, calculation, and clear purpose to instill fear, break the will, and eliminate the ability to resist. Investigators viewed this as a distinctive signature, functioning like a criminal signature, similar to cases where perpetrators repeat a personal ritual to mark their victims. When cross-referencing Jerome's account of the route traveled in a semi-conscious state with the amount of coal dust recovered from the truck's step-up, the investigative team narrowed Rustler's primary area of operation to a corridor in Appalachia, stretching from the outskirts of Delbarton to remote forested areas near Phelps. This region features a complex network of forest roads, numerous abandoned coal mines, wide enough trails for pickup trucks to move without making much noise, and virtually no traffic camera surveillance. Rustler's thorough knowledge of the local terrain, his ability to navigate unmarked forest routes not found on standard maps, indicated he was not a random drifter, but likely a local or someone with long experience in the coal mining industry, familiar with how to exploit old mine structures to avoid detection. When analyzing the list of unsolved missing persons cases in the Appalachian area over the past 10 years, the investigation team noted several similarities. Most victims were long-haul drivers or workers in domestic transportation. Many disappearances occurred near small gas stations or areas without cameras. In some cases, trucks were found in a condition identical to Jerome's parked neatly, but with no footprints around the cab. Although there was no direct evidence yet to confirm Rustler's involvement in all those cases, investigators considered this an important basis for hypothesizing the existence of a persistent criminal pattern with established procedures and clear targets, where typical victims were individuals easily isolated and unlikely to be seen for the last time by a large community. Drawing from Jerome's detailed account of being approached with the dead truck on the forested slope ploy and the timing of the ether-soaked cloth attack, the investigative team concluded that Rustler had extensive knowledge of drivers' approach habits, knew how to select camera blind spots, knew how to fabricate a technical issue on the vehicle to force the target into a bent-over inspection posture, thereby making control easy. The capture pattern was quick, clean, and left no loud noises or signs of struggle, consistent with him having used this method multiple times before. Considering all the elements, the traces on the truck, coal dust samples, circular scars on Jerome's wrists and ankles, layered carved characters, his statement about the forest transit route, and the fact that Jerome was found far from the point of disappearance, the investigative team officially placed Rustler at the top of the suspect list. Motive, approach method, confinement pattern, and injury behavior all aligned with an individual capable of sustaining a repeated criminal system over a long period. Placing him on the suspect list was based not only on Jerome's testimony, but also on the close match between multiple physical traces directly related to the capture and control process, providing preliminary grounds for the assessment that this subject did not act randomly but in an organized manner, with clear targets and methods that turned victims into tools for forced labor, while eliminating escape possibilities through forms of violence that clearly marked dominance. The space Jerome Walker described during his interrogation sessions was an abandoned coal storage shed near the outskirts of the town of Belfry, where old mining structures had been steeped in coal dust and rust for many years, creating an environment thick with the smell of minerals, rotted motor oil, and dampness seeping from decaying wooden walls. Inside the shed was an area of near-total darkness, because most of the windows had been covered with rusted sheet metal, allowing only a thin sliver of light to filter in from a hole in the high wooden roof. The cold dirt floor was mixed with coal fragments, making every step feel heavy, and the sound of metal clanging echoed whenever anything was moved, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Jerome was confined in a small chamber built from rough planks and steel wire, less than 2 meters wide, just enough to sit or lie curled up, with the door secured by a metal bar he couldn't reach while bound. He recounted that every morning the perpetrator would open the cell door, toss in a piece of dry bread or a cheap boxed meal, then begin escorting him to the work area. His tasks had no fixed schedule and depended entirely on Rustler's mood. Some days he had to haul nearly 40-kilogram sacks of dry coal from one corner of the shed to the stacking area near the old mine entrance. Other days he had to help clean up rusted machinery parts that Rustler had collected from abandoned extraction sites. On some days, he had to haphazardly clear pathways with a shovel or bare hands if the shovel had been confiscated as punishment. These jobs took place in a low-oxygen environment, with thick layers of coal dust causing constant dry coughing and throat irritation. Jerome said that during the first many weeks, he tried to follow orders precisely to minimize torture. But any slowdown or sign of fatigue prompted Rustler to immediately respond with hard blows to the back, shoulders, or ribs, leaving bruises of varying ages that doctors later documented. In his statement, Jerome clearly described the frequency of the skin carvings. At first, just a few scattered characters on the inner arms, usually when he accidentally dropped a coal sack or couldn't lift a heavy machine part. Later on, as his strength faded, The carvings appeared more often, sometimes only 1 or 2 days apart, and the depth varied depending on how Rustler judged his infraction. He used a small, sharp knife, sometimes heated to make cleaner cuts, and each time Jerome was unable to resist because his wrists were still bound with electrical cord or zip ties. He described the metallic scraping sound against skin, the heat of the blade, and the mix of coal and blood smells that made it impossible to escape panic, with memories of some cuts still causing him to jolt awake during sleep even after he was rescued and treated. Besides Jerome's cell, he recounted that 2 other men were held in similar wooden chambers. One was older, with an emaciated frame, the other younger but constantly coughing and exhausted. They were rarely allowed to speak to each other because Rustler tightly controlled movement times between cells and the work area. But Jerome still remembered the older man's hoarse whisper when they passed each other. He muttered a few broken sentences about being taken on the highway and having been there a very long time. The younger one was often tied to a wooden post by Rustler when too fatigued to work, and each time, his groans echoed through Jerome's cell walls. The presence of these 2 men wasn't continuous, because at certain points, Jerome no longer heard them, but he didn't know what happened to them since he never saw it with his own eyes. During many months of captivity, Jerome often witnessed Rustler bringing in crates, sacks, or materials from his trips, mostly valuable machinery parts, new spare components, coils of cable, or even sealed crates that he forced Jerome to open or sort. Some crates bore labels from various trucking companies, which made Jerome realize the man wasn't targeting just one victim, but likely approaching multiple drivers along low surveillance routes. Jerome described how Rustler moved the goods quite roughly, dragging or tossing them onto the shed floor and kicking up thick coal dust like fog. Yet he appeared familiar with each type of item, as if he had prior experience in transportation or extraction work. Jerome's movement was always limited to about 20 meters from his cell, because the rest of the area was blocked by large wooden panels and chains, forming a narrow maze he couldn't freely navigate. When not working, he was locked in his cell with the door secured by a large metal bar and an additional padlock. The work area was separated by makeshift steel and wood barriers, forcing him to operate only in a small zone within Rustler's direct line of sight. Both the cell and work area lacked natural light, with only one hanging bulb overhead that flickered constantly, so he had to rely on hearing to gauge whether Rustler was nearby. Every time he heard the man's footsteps crunching through the coal-dusted dirt floor, Jerome tensed because he knew an inspection or punishment could come at any moment. Everything he described reflected a crude but effective confinement system for controlling victims. Narrow space, dim light, limited exits, repeated forced labor, and punitive behavior designed to maintain dominance, all combined to create an existence Jerome couldn't escape throughout the 16 months of captivity. When the investigative team began analyzing the evidence collected from Jerome Walker's clothing, shoes, and hair, the forensic group quickly realized that the dust clinging to his body wasn't ordinary dirt, but had the distinctive mineral composition of deep-mined coal dust, a type of dust typically found only in decommissioned coal mines or poorly ventilated underground areas. For detailed analysis, technicians used specialized combs to gather samples from Jerome's hair, then separated individual strands to examine the layered dust buildup according to daily structure. The presence of multiple thin layers of coal dust interspersed with soil proved he had lived in a coal-contaminated environment for an extended period, with exposure cycles varying according to each instance of forced labor. On the collar and cuffs of his shirt, the forensic team used special adhesive tape to collect surface samples, recording the presence of 3 types of mineral particles: porous bituminous coal, small fragment anthracite, and crushed pyrite, all hallmarks of multi-seam coal mines. The torn soles of Jerome's shoes still retained compacted chunks of coal pressed into the rubber treads, with larger grains fractured along crystal structures indicating they had endured compression on hard surfaces, similar to storage shed floors or old tunnel beds. When analyzing the composition via Raman spectroscopy, the technical team identified silica impurities and montmorillonite clay minerals in the dust samples, 2 components commonly found at mines on the outskirts of Belfry, where a series of abandoned mines dated back to the 1980s. To narrow the comparison range, The investigation's geology team compiled a full list of coal mines within a 50-mile radius of Belfry, including those that had conducted deep mining in the Appalachian Mountains. The initial list included 23 closed mines, each with its own unique mineral composition and dust structure due to differing sedimentary conditions. Technicians compared Jerome's dust samples to archived samples from each mine, focusing on pyrite content and fixed carbon ratios, as these two parameters often help distinguish the origin of the coal. When compared to Belfry Mine 22, the forensic group noted an exceptional match. Jerome's dust sample contained low-reflectance bituminous coal, with a layered structure characteristic of records documented in this mine's geological file from 1979. Additionally, the fragmented anthracite form in his shoe sample showed oxidation levels corresponding to the western tunnel sections of the mine, an area long abandoned and sealed without thorough cleanup. Deeper analysis, using scanning electron microscopy, revealed cubic pyrite crystals with chipped edges in Jerome's hair dust, sample a geometric pattern matching mineral specimens from Belfry Mine 22, reported in Kentucky Department of TESA. Means documentation, as this area featured pyrite crystallization under low-pressure conditions that resulted in imperfect cubic shapes. Other mines within the 50-mile radius, such as Warfield Mine, Pond Creek Mine, or sites south near Buckfield, had different mineral structures, mostly semi-bituminous coal or high-hardness anthracite that did not match the samples taken from Jerome. Analysis of secondary components in the dust adhering to his ankles showed higher than normal montmorillonite clay levels, consistent with the soil layer in tunnel level number 3 of Belfry Mine 22, a zone mentioned in old extraction technical reports as an wet, prone to collapse area with significant mineral mud accumulation. The convergence of all three factors, coal, particle structure, pyrite crystal form, and clay content, gave the forensic team sufficient grounds to conclude that the coal dust accumulated on Jerome originated from the tunnel system of Belfry Mine 22 or its immediate vicinity. To reinforce this assessment, the investigation team collected supplemental soil samples from forested areas adjacent to the mine and around the sealed entrances of Belfry Mine 22. Soil samples from those locations showed identical fragmented coal crystals to those found on Jerome's clothing, particularly a micromineral formation resulting from the mixture of coal and moisture in enclosed spaces, something commonly seen in sealed, unventilated abandoned mines. After ruling out all other mines within the 50-mile radius that lacked corresponding matches, the investigative force concluded with a high degree of certainty that Jerome's place of confinement was very likely within the old sealed tunnel system of Belfry Mine 22. This conclusion was based not only on mineral matches, but also on the multi-layered coal dust adhesion pattern on Jerome's shoes and clothing, leading the forensic group to determine he had repeatedly moved across mine tunnel floors or connected storage areas directly linked to the mine. Pinpointing the exact origin of the coal dust became a crucial environmental piece of evidence, allowing the investigative team to establish the legal basis for obtaining a search warrant, covering the entire Belfry Mine 22 area, including main tunnels, side branches, old storage sheds, sealed entrances, and points marked in mine closure records from many years prior. When the investigative team approached the abandoned entrance area of Belfry Mine 22, they quickly noticed an anomaly at a point previously recorded in the mine closure files. A large rusted sheet metal panel secured with wedged rocks and steel wire had been shifted from its original position, with fresh soil displacement along the lower edge, indicating the barrier had been moved in the not-too-distant past. The ground directly in front of the entrance still bore irregular drag ruts, possibly from a heavy object being pulled in or out of the area, and the surface soil mixed with coal dust around it showed old footprints overlapping newer ones in various directions. Though not intact enough for clear identification, they still indicated human presence. Once the sheet metal was fully removed, a low opening appeared, leading into the old, dark, and damp tunnel with air thickly saturated with a mineral smell. The examination team entered, using high-powered lights to sweep the tunnel walls and floor. After a few minutes of movement, they discovered 3 small confinement chambers constructed from old wooden planks and scrap steel. Each chamber was no more than 2 square meters, with doors made of roughly joined boards, secured by improvised metal bars. Adjacent to these chambers was a haphazard electrical wiring system running from the ceiling down to the ground, mostly wrapped in old electrical tape, showing someone had deliberately set up a makeshift power source to light the single dangling bulb in the central area. One of the 3 chambers had steel wire wrapped around the door latch, as if added to increase security against a victim breaking free. The investigation team checked each chamber and found several key pieces of evidence. In the first chamber, they recovered a small, thin-bladed steel knife with a wooden handle, the blade still bearing dried brownish streaks, suspected to be human blood. The blade showed even wear along the edge, consistent with the carving injuries on Jerome's body. In the second chamber, they found a metal chair bound with electrical cord, the seat surface still bearing a thin layer of dried blood along the edges. Nearby was a bucket containing gray-brown residue mixed with shed human skin flakes, indicating this had been a spot where the perpetrator cleaned tools or forced victims to wash wounds after carving. In the third chamber, technicians found multiple snapped zip ties, frayed rope, and a blood-stained cloth fragment. These items were carefully collected and placed in evidence bags for forensic testing. When sweeping light across the wooden walls surrounding the confinement chambers, the investigation team noticed numerous strange characters deeply carved with a sharp object. The shape, depth, and vertical row arrangement of these characters matched the injuries on Jerome's chest, back, and arms. Some characters were still fresh, with sharp edges, and even some wood panels retained unweathered coal dust not yet eroded by wind or moisture, proving the perpetrator had returned to the area multiple times. The technical team used measuring tools to record the dimensions of each character, cross-reference them with Jerome's wounds, and map the carved character layout on the walls to establish connections between character groups and their formation timelines. When expanding the examination to the flatter central section of the tunnel, they discovered numerous tiny blood droplets in elongated drip patterns, likely from an injured person moving under duress. Nearby, the ground showed an unusually darkened area, mixed with old cellular tissue fragments, confirmed by enzyme test strips as human tissue. This area also carried a faint burnt odor of organic material from long ago. The forensic team lightly excavated the soil and uncovered a shallow pit containing black ash, mixed with curved metal fragments, possibly remnants of burned items. Some bone fragments mixed in were collected for analysis. Around this pit were melted plastic pieces, suggesting the perpetrator used fire to destroy evidence or victim traces. Continuing a few meters deeper, the examination team found a makeshift storage corner with assorted items: old burlap sacks, food box wrappers, torn rubber gloves, and tools such as a small hammer, pliers, and a rusty knife. A broken flashlight lay against the wooden wall, its head still bearing dried blood. All were collected and sent to the lab for fingerprint, DNA, and cellular analysis. When sweeping light to the left side of the tunnel, they discovered scratch marks on the stone wall directed inward, indicating a heavy object had struck the wall while being dragged. On the ground in this area were shallow furrows, resembling drag marks from a significant weight. Not far away was a larger ash pile carrying the burnt smell of rubber and synthetic fabric, suggesting this had been a regular spot for destroying evidence. Within the ash pile, the investigation team found a partially charred cloth fragment with incomplete characters, the cut edges still visible from a blade, and a small bone segment matching human finger bone structure. Each piece of evidence was precisely documented with coordinates, photographed, and packaged for detailed analysis. The discovery of the confinement chambers, restraint tools, carving knife, wall carvings, blood samples, cellular tissue, and evidence-burning areas formed a cohesive whole, demonstrating that the tunnel section in Belfry Mine 22 had been used as an organized detention facility, where the perpetrator carried out forced labor, torture, and trace destruction using crude but effective methods in a secluded, hard-to-access space with no community oversight. When the bone fragments and cellular tissue samples recovered from the chamber area of Belfry Mine 22 were brought into the examination room, the analysis team immediately focused on the skeletal remains sized consistent with hand bones and wrist bones, because the surface wear on the bone and the sharp cut marks suggested these were not animal bones. Several samples were cleaned with an enzyme solution to remove tightly adhered coal dust, then scanned under an electron microscope to identify edge-cut traces. The technicians discovered parallel grooves running along the length of the cut on the bone surface, uniform in depth and width, characteristic of a thin, sharp blade with a keenness similar to the knife recovered from the mine's holding cell. These grooves showed no signs of a serrated blade. They were entirely smooth, continuous cuts, matching the engraving style recorded on Jerome Walker's body. When the bone samples were extracted for DNA under maximum contamination control conditions, the analysis team obtained nuclear DNA sequences of sufficient quality to enter into the CODIS system for comparison against unsolved missing persons cases in the Appalachian region. The results showed a significant match with the biometric profile of a truck driver named Michael R. Dunford, who was reported missing in 2016 while traveling a freight route from Knoxville up into the West Virginia corridor. The DNA match provided grounds to confirm that these bone samples belonged to a victim who vanished mysteriously, leaving behind no trace except an abandoned truck at a rest stop more than 40 miles from Belfry. As the forensic team analyzed additional bone samples, they noted a rib fragment bearing worn engraved lettering, but the curved line features were still recognizable and similar to the character style found on the wooden walls of the holding cell. The depth of the cut, marks on the bone indicated this behavior was carried out while the victim was still alive or shortly after death, before soft tissue had fully decomposed, as evidenced by scratch marks remaining at the boundary between bone and tissue. These features reinforce the hypothesis that Rustler not only used skin engraving as a sign of control, but also performed similar acts on the corpse or skeletal remains of victims, treating it as a form of criminal signature. When the DNA results and cut mark characteristics were compiled, Rustler's profile was expanded from a suspect in detention and torture to a multiple homicide suspect due to the connection between Michael Dunford's bones and the torture indicators matching the method Jerome described. The investigation team broadened the review of missing truck drivers along the Appalachian corridor over an 8-year period, focusing on cases involving sudden disappearance near small gas stations, low-traffic rest areas, or isolated road segments close to abandoned mining sites. Initial reports documented at least 6 cases fitting the pattern: abrupt loss of contact, trucks found in largely undisturbed condition, no strong signs of struggle, and no clues left regarding final direction of travel. During this analysis, the investigation team noticed a recurring factor. The 2 drivers reported missing in 2014 and 2017 were both frequent travelers on routes through the Kentucky-West Virginia border region, where many abandoned mines similar to Belfry Mine 22 are located. When they pulled the photo records of one of the 2017 drivers, the victim's family had reported that he habitually refused to assist strangers on the road, but that did not rule out the possibility he was ambushed in a manner similar to Jerome approached, under the pretext of a broken-down vehicle or a request for technical help. The discovery of engraved characters on the confirmed bones of Dunford represented a major turning point, as it clearly linked the perpetrator's behavioral style to the injury patterns on the victim. The technical team analyzed each engraved line, comparing depth and cut angle to identify the blade used, thereby further strengthening the evidence that Rustler exhibited a ritualistic pattern of violence. The DNA evidence from the bones not only identified the victim but also proved that the mine chamber area in Belfry Mine 22 had served as either a body storage site or a temporary holding point before the perpetrator disposed of. Evidence. When the DNA samples, engravings, and missing persons information were linked within the same system, an expanded suspect profile was established, listing Rustler as the individual, likely responsible for a chain of crimes involving cargo theft, detention, torture, and murder, spanning multiple years and extending along the Appalachian trucking routes where many drivers pass through unmonitored locations. The letter engraving behavior became the perpetrator's distinctive signature, enabling investigators to classify other missing persons cases with similar elements in order to search for additional potential victims. Jerome Walker recounted that the only opportunity that allowed him to escape the confinement tunnel in Belfry Mine 22 came on a rare night when Rustler drank too much alcohol. According to him, that day the man brought back a cheap case of beer and a bottle of hard liquor. sat right next to the area where coal sacks were stacked, and kept drinking while muttering unclear sentences. He didn't check Jerome's restraints as usual, and assigned him the task of carrying lighter sacks to the corner of the tunnel, probably because he believed Jerome's strength was exhausted, and he no longer had the ability to escape in a space where he knew every entrance. Jerome realized his body was weak, but his mind was clearer than usual because he had eaten some leftover food from the work shift. At that moment, he was allowed to move freely within a small area, hands unbound, only monitored by Rustler's glassy stare. When he approached a pile of materials at the edge of the wooden wall, Jerome noticed a broken-legged metal rack. Underneath it lay a long bolt, nearly 2 handspans that had fallen out of place. He bent down, pretending to adjust the sacks, used his fingertips to push the bolt toward his palm, then clamped it between the folds of his pants fabric to avoid making noise. The metal rod was heavy enough to cause injury but small enough to conceal in his hand, without Rustler noticing while he was intoxicated. Jerome continued carrying the sacks to the assigned corner, trying to hide his rapid breathing from the tension. He said his heart pounded so hard he thought Rustler might hear it. When he glanced over his shoulder, he saw the man leaning against the wooden wall, head slumped, one hand still loosely holding the liquor bottle in a grip so slack that the slightest touch would make it fall. That moment made Jerome realize that if he missed this chance, he might never get another. He moved a few more sacks closer to pretend he was busy, then slowly shifted in an arc behind Rustler's back, always keeping enough distance to avoid stirring up too much coal dust noise. Jerome gripped the bolt tightly in his hand, feeling the cold metal numb his palm, but that only strengthened his resolve. When he was just a few steps away, he tried to slow his breathing, aimed precisely at the spot behind the man's head where the dim yellow light from the flickering bulb cast shadows. After 3 seconds of hesitation, Jerome raised the bolt straight and swung it down hard. The heavy sound of metal striking skulls startled him, but Rustler only managed a choked grunt before slumping sideways. The liquor bottle shattered on the coal floor with a small crash, but in the deep tunnel, no one else could hear it except him. Jerome struck once more to make sure Rustler couldn't get up right away, then immediately searched the man's pockets for keys. He said his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the keys steady, but he finally found a keyring covered in dust and oil. However, when he ran to the main tunnel entrance, the one Rustler had used when bringing in supplies, Jerome immediately felt his body turn ice cold. The outside of the main door had a chain lock secured from the exterior, meaning the man always locked it when leaving to ensure no victim could escape. The tunnel door was also wedged with heavy rocks that he couldn't push aside even with all his strength. There was no way out here. In that moment of despair, Jerome said he took a deep breath and looked around the work area, searching for any gap that might lead outside. He remembered that whenever strong wind blew, the tunnel produced a faint whistling sound from a specific direction. This made him believe there had to be some ventilation shaft connected to the surface. He ran along the stone wall, hands touching every damp surface, until he found a section of older wooden wall that wasn't reinforced with steel like the other areas. High up, more than 2 meters, was a rusted steel mesh grate fastened to the wooden frame that was the vent opening. He climbed onto a nearby stack of coal sacks, used a pointed key to pry at the edges of the grate. The rusted metal was so weak that a few hard twists started to loosen it. As he neared completion, Jerome heard Rustler stirring behind him, a pained wheezing sound rising that told him the man wasn't fully unconscious. Jerome yanked the last of the grate free, pushed it down to the floor, then shoved his head into the vent shaft. Inside was a rough, long pipe thick with dust and a heavy damp smell. He had to crawl on elbows and knees, his body scraping the pipe walls and burning his skin. But when he looked up, he saw a faint light at the far end, the first light he had seen in many months of darkness. He kept crawling, sometimes getting stuck where the pipe narrowed, sometimes twisting to pass a rotting wood obstruction. Every time he heard echoes from behind, he pushed himself faster. After an unclear length of time, Jerome reached soft soil. He used both hands to dig, pushing dirt out of the pipe opening. Clumps fell away to reveal the outside space. When it was wide enough, he squeezed his shoulders through first, and finally emerged from the vent mouth, tumbling onto a sloped dirt floor leading into the forest. Outside was cold air, but to him it smelled like freedom. Jerome said his legs could barely stand, so he crawled along the hillside, following the direction of the faint night sky glow. He didn't know how long he crawled through decaying leaves and coal dust on the ground. Every time the wind rose, he heard the crack of dry branches and feared it was Rustler pursuing him. He kept dragging himself through the forest path until he saw the tree line open to a wider clearing, signaling proximity to residential areas. As he neared the boundary with Phelps, he collapsed multiple times from exhaustion, body covered in wounds, skin torn from scraping the vent pipe. When the local resident found him in a state of gasping breaths and violent trembling, the last thing he saw was the local person who discovered him before his eyes closed from utter depletion. The psychologists began assessing Jerome Walker's condition as soon as he was able to communicate stably, and the initial signs quickly revealed the profound level of psychological trauma he had endured throughout his captivity in the confined mine environment. In the first evaluation session, even the light clank of a metal tray in the hospital room caused him to bolt upright with such a strong defensive reflex that nurses had to intervene, displaying a classic symptom of PTSD commonly seen in victims of prolonged violence. Doctors noted that any sharp, heavy, or metallic-sounding noise triggered an exaggerated startle response, sudden spike in heart rate, and cold sweats, indicating that his brain was still maintaining a state of hypervigilance, as if Rustler were still nearby and could appear at any moment. These reactions did not only occur when he was caught off guard, but also in many ordinary situations, such as opening a door, pulling out a chair, or hearing medical instruments. Severe sleep disturbance was also clearly documented. Jerome could only sleep in short bursts and often woke up in a state of panic, gasping for breath, eyes darting rapidly, as if trying to orient himself in the surrounding darkness. He described recurring nightmares in which he was trapped in a confined space, unable to breathe, or hearing footsteps echoing from a distant darkness. The fragmented images he recounted to the specialists were all tied to the thick darkness of the mine, the narrow space, the faint light from a hanging bulb, and the sensation of skin being stretched taut along with the sound of a knife blade scraping across wood. This showed that his brain was re-experiencing memories in the form of flashbacks, a type of involuntary recollection that made it difficult for him to distinguish between past and present during intense triggers. In addition, his strong tendency to avoid memories related to the captivity period was evident. Whenever doctors tried to bring up features of the mine, he would immediately fall silent, clench his fists, or turn his face away to avoid confronting it. He was unable to describe the mine structure in detail without triggering panic responses, and even when asked indirectly, he would often change the subject or request to end the therapy session. This aligned with the typical avoidance mechanism in PTSD, where the mind actively blocks traumatic memories to reduce fear, even though it hinders the recovery process. The specialists also noted a decline in communication function. Jerome frequently paused mid-sentence, hesitating as if images in his mind interrupted his train of thought, making it impossible for him to express himself fully. He repeatedly described his brain as feeling locked up, with a sense that he could not retrieve memories in a seamless way. This was a sign of disrupted memory integration, commonly seen in individuals held in harsh environments with little light, minimal social interaction, and prolonged psychological violence. His short-term memory was also affected. He easily forgot information that had just been discussed and required multiple repetitions to ensure he understood medical instructions or therapy steps. During in-depth psychological evaluation, doctors recorded that he constantly scanned the room with his eyes, even when there were no unusual sounds, as if checking for escape routes or whether someone might emerge from the dark corners. This excessive vigilance behavior was not just a reflex, but also impacted his daily functioning. He found it hard to sit still for long because he was always afraid of being locked back in a confined space. When asked to describe the feeling of standing in a narrow room, he immediately felt chest tightness and shortness of breath, a clear manifestation of panic disorder linked to his prior captivity environment. The specialists assessed that Jerome's long-term recovery potential depended heavily on his ability to gradually rebuild a sense of safety, learn to process triggers related to traumatic memories, and strengthen emotional tolerance. However, the risk of recurring panic attacks was rated high, especially in environments with metallic sounds, darkness, or restricted movement. His post-traumatic stress intensity remained severe, requiring a long-term treatment regimen that included controlled exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and memory reconsolidation. At the same time, Jerome needed mild sedative medication in the initial phase to regulate sleep and reduce the intensity of reactions to reminder triggers. The psychological report also indicated that the impact on communication and memory functions could take many months, even years, to recover, because his brain had operated in a survival state for too long, causing uneven activity in language and emotion processing areas. The specialists recommended an intensive therapy program combining emotional regulation, training, group therapy for survivors of captivity, and close monitoring throughout the behavioral adjustment process to help Jerome gradually rebuild a normal life without daily activities being paralyzed by panic attacks. The identification of Rustler became the focus of the investigative team around the single most important clue: the old rusty-colored Chevy Silverado that Jerome Walker described as the vehicle the perpetrator used to approach him at the Matewan Gas and Go station. The investigation team began by retrieving all camera footage from the Matewan area during the time frame of Jerome's disappearance, including the gas station cameras, traffic cameras near the Iron Bridge on Route 49, and small stores around downtown Matewan. Although the Silverado did not appear clearly on the main gas station camera, the technical team discovered a blurry segment from a locksmith shop 2 blocks away that captured the silhouette of a silver-gray pickup with heavily peeling paint, a distinct large rust patch on the right side panel. Based on speed and direction of travel, the investigation team reconstructed the vehicle's route map, showing it leaving Matewan toward Delbarton, an area with numerous dirt roads leading deep into the hilly terrain bordering coal mines. From there, they narrowed license plate queries, focusing on Silverado models from 1998 to 2002 registered in the Delbarton and Williamson areas. Many vehicles on the list were eliminated because they did not match the paint color or cab shape recorded by the camera. However, one 2000 model Silverado previously registered under the name Roy Hanlon stood out because registration records showed the vehicle had changed ownership multiple times without any completed technical inspections. Another notable point: the license plate in the camera footage was heavily mud-covered, but the last part appeared to be 27, matching the final 2 digits of Hanlon's old plate, according to 2012 records. The investigative force continued querying repair shops in the Delbarton area for invoices related to maintenance or parts replacement on a 2000 Silverado. A small garage near the entrance to an abandoned mine road provided information that about 2 years earlier, a middle-aged man brought in a silver Silverado with peeling paint to replace the spark plugs, throttle cable, and repair the right fender. The shop owner described 2 large rust patches on the side, very similar to Jerome's statement. Payment was made in cash with no contact information left, but the shop's security camera retained a blurry image of the man, sufficient for the investigation team to recognize a build matching Jerome's description of Rustler: muscular frame, heavy gait, and slightly slanted left shoulder. They also gathered information that this man frequently stopped by to buy used parts and asked questions about increasing towing power for forest roads. Cross-referencing parts, purchase invoices continued to expand leads. A parts store in Phelps had once sold this man 2 sets of tow hooks, an industrial flashlight set, and a high-strength electrical cable coil, the exact type recovered in Belfry Mine 22. The investigation team began piecing together indirect evidence of Rustler's movements based on the Silverado's travel paths. Traffic camera data on the road segment, connecting Delbarton to the Kentucky border, recorded the vehicle's shadow on multiple different days over a period of about 4 years. Though the images were blurry, the movement pattern, cab height, and patchy silver rust areas all matched, proving this vehicle had been consistently active around Belfry, Phelps, and abandoned mine roads. The team cross-referenced the vehicle's appearance times with reports of unsolved cargo thefts along the Appalachian route. In 6 incidents from 2015 to 2018, 3 had witnesses who reported seeing an old silver Silverado leaving the scene toward the forest. All 3 descriptions mentioned an unusually heavy engine sound, consistent with an old vehicle or one with mismatched repairs. Examining the missing cargo cases, The team noted that stolen goods were primarily mechanical parts, high-value components, and items reusable in industrial settings, perfectly matching the items recovered in Belfry Mine 22. As the name Roy Hanlon appeared more frequently in documents, the investigative force checked his personal records. The man's full name was Roy Benjamin Hanlon, who had lived in the hills near Delbarton, with a history as a mechanic for small mining companies and a dismissal for violent behavior toward co-workers. Court records showed Hanlon was accused of assaulting a truck driver in 2010, though the victim did not pursue charges. Notably, Hanlon had worked part-time at a metal shop adjacent to Belfry Mine 22, giving him access to lesser-known side entrances. These factors led investigators to conclude that Roy Rustler Hanlon not only possessed the vehicle, terrain knowledge, and mechanical skills fitting the criminal pattern, but also appeared repeatedly at key points connected to the case. When linking all the information from Matewan camera footage, license plate registration history, repair invoices, witness descriptions, to indirect evidence from cargo thefts, the investigative team officially determined that Roy Rustler Hanlon was the central suspect linked to the abduction of Jerome Walker and the disappearances along the Appalachian route. Tracking the movements of the rusty Chevy Silverado not only helped investigators determine the vehicle's route, but also pinpointed Roy Rustler Hanlon's most recent area of operation. Based on traffic camera data along the route connecting Delbarton to the Kentucky border area, the analysis team spotted the Silverado appearing repeatedly at various times, especially in the days leading up to the search of Belfry Mine 22. Cameras on the eastern trail of Pigeon Roost showed the vehicle with its peeling paint on the tail and distinctive rust patches on the right side, moving slowly in the direction of the woods, consistent with carrying heavy or bulky loads. After mapping the frequency of movements, investigators noticed the vehicle tended to return to the same cluster of dirt roads near the West Virginia-Kentucky border, an area with only a few access points that could easily be controlled with roadblocks. An arrest plan was developed based on the assumption that Rustler would return to this area within 48 hours, especially since he was unaware that Belfry Mine 22 had been searched. The Special Tactics team positioned multiple ambush units along the Appalachian Ridge Road stretch, with two primary checkpoints near the intersection with Highway 1056, and secondary checkpoints leading deeper into the forest trails. To avoid drawing attention, the officers' vehicles were disguised as local road maintenance trucks or hunting vehicles. Around 7:40 p.m., a camera mounted on a traffic pole captured the distinctive dim yellow headlights of the old Silverado moving from the forest direction out onto the main road. The vehicle's speed was slow, matching Jerome's description of the heavy, labored movement when Rustler was transporting stolen cargo. The interception procedure was immediately activated. As the vehicle approached the narrow section near the low bridge, the first team turned on their emergency lights and quickly blocked the northern turnoff. At the same time, the second team approached from behind in unmarked vehicles to prevent Rustler from turning around. When he saw the flashing red lights ahead, Rustler slowed down but did not shut off the engine, forcing investigators to close in quickly. An officer used the loudspeaker to order him to step out of the vehicle with both hands raised high. At first he appeared hesitant, repeatedly scanning both sides of the road as if calculating an escape possibility, but as officers moved closer, and one swept a flashlight across the truck bed, revealing clear coal sacks and scattered metal items, Rustler was forced to open the door. As soon as he stepped down, he was immediately handcuffed to prevent resistance. During the on-site quick search, investigators seized from his jacket pocket a thin-bladed knife with old coal and blood residue on the handle, matching the type of knife recovered from the mine. Inside the cab, they found additional zip ties, rubber-coated electrical wire, a rubber glove with fresh coal dust, and a cloth bag containing a recently used vehicle repair toolkit. A quick magnetic scan revealed that the glove and driver's seat retained coal particles of the same type as samples from Belfry Mine 22, further supporting the suspicion that Rustler had just left an area connected to the crime scene. The truck bed contained several mechanical parts and items previously reported stolen in cargo thefts along the Appalachian corridor. The Silverado was subsequently sealed and transported to the Pike County impound lot for comprehensive forensic examination. Mud caked under the chassis and coal dust in the bed were sampled on site. A secondary GPS tracker hidden under the dashboard was discovered and removed for movement data analysis, even though Rustler had deliberately disconnected the power. Meanwhile, he was taken to the nearest police station to begin formal interrogation. Upon being escorted into the interview room, he maintained a stubborn silence, answering only insignificant questions and avoiding any mention of his recent travels. Nevertheless, officers noted numerous coal stains on his shirt cuffs, pant hems, and even the shoes he was wearing, dust with size and color matching that recovered from the mine tunnel. Another notable detail was a small, recently dried scratch on his left hand, consistent with abrasion from scraping against a stone wall or hard object in a confined space. The successful arrest of Roy Rustler Hanlon marked a major breakthrough in the investigation, as the effectiveness of the roadblock plan based on the Silverado's movement data ensured he had no opportunity to destroy evidence or flee into the vast and difficult-to-control Appalachian Mountains. Investigators completed on-scene evidence documentation, including the engraving knife, restraint cords, coal-stained gloves, suspected stolen parts, and the entire vehicle, before moving to the formal interrogation phase to clarify his chain of actions related to the detention and torture of Jerome Walker, as well as other disappearances along the Appalachian trucking routes. In the first official interrogation session, Roy Rustler Hanlon sat leaning back against the wall, eyes narrowed under the interrogation room lights, maintaining the cold demeanor familiar from descriptions in the investigative file. When the investigators presented the series of evidence recovered from Belfry Mine 22, he tried to keep an indifferent attitude, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly each time images of the confinement chambers, zip ties, and the thin-bladed knife appeared on the table. After more than 20 minutes of silence, when asked why he was present in the abandoned mine area, Hanlon suddenly gave a scornful laugh and said that anyone who worked as a mechanic in Appalachia had at some point poked around those tunnels. His stubbornness gradually faded when the investigators shifted to confrontation using forensic evidence related to the coal dust, the carvings on the walls, and bone fragments with cut marks consistent with his knife blade. At that point, Hanlon began releasing pieces of his statement not entirely voluntary, but enough to clearly outline the criminal pattern he had carried out for many years. He admitted that his purpose in approaching long-haul drivers was to steal valuable cargo, especially mechanical parts or materials that could be resold. When he spotted a truck parked at a quiet station, he would observe for a long time before pretending to have a breakdown to make the driver bend down to check the engine. Using an ether-soaked cloth to anesthetize was the method he repeated because it was quick, clean, and quiet. After subduing the driver, he would take the victim to holding points in the mine tunnels and force them into unpaid labor to load and unload stolen goods or disassemble components for easier disposal. He insisted this was a self-owned economic cycle, a description that made the investigators realize he viewed his criminal behavior as a small-scale business model rather than a series of violent acts. While speaking, Hanlon spun the metal handcuffs around his hand, as if only concerned with the immediate inconvenience, showing no awareness of the gravity of his admissions. When asked about the carvings on Jerome's skin and those of other victims, Hanlon did not deny it. He said they were ownership marks, something he used to remind victims of their place in the system he ran himself. He described carving letters into skin as if it were a routine technical act. If you don't mark them, they'll think they're still free. He even explained that the knife was sharpened in a specific way to create deep cuts without excessive bleeding, indicating he had practiced this many times. The calm manner in which he described it led investigators to note that this was not just physical violence but a ritualistic form of control. When questioned about holding victims for extended periods, Hanlon simply said he needed free manpower to transport stolen goods. He emphasized that forced labor was the only way to keep the operation going, likening it to how a farm owner keeps workers on the job. He said, "I don't do anything except take what I need and make them do their part." The dehumanizing attitude in his words made the entire interrogation session feel heavy. Regarding accomplices, Hanlon completely denied any. He said no one else knew the locations of the mine tunnels he used, and no one helped with transporting goods. When asked how he sustained the operation alone, he explained that he was familiar with mine roads, knew how to avoid cameras, and always changed routes whenever he felt watched. He saw himself as the last of the old way of life in Appalachia, a self-reliant survivor running his criminal model without help from anyone. The investigators did not fully believe this, but temporarily recorded the statement because it aligned with the existing evidence. When the bone fragments found in the mine were mentioned, Hanlon's expression immediately changed, and he flatly denied any killings. He said victims might have died from mine accidents or running away and falling, but he could provide no specific details to support that. When asked why there were carving marks on the bones, he shrugged and said he didn't remember doing it, then accused the investigative team of trying to piece everything together to frame him. This contradictory attitude led investigators to note that although he denied it, the physical evidence pointed the opposite way. But within the limits of the interrogation session, they only recorded the statement according to procedure. The investigators continued pressing Hanlon to explain the concept of ownership marks he frequently mentioned when talking about carving letters into victims' skin. He described the act as a management signature, something he believed helped him psychologically control victims so they understood that resistance would only make the carvings deeper. He added that the shapes of the characters had personal meaning to him, related to how he categorized victims by level of usefulness. Although he did not reveal details of each character, the investigators recognized this behavior as a combination of physical violence and an obsessive need for power, reflecting a perverse control tendency rather than pure coercion. When asked about the deeper motive behind this criminal pattern, Hanlon replied that it all started from anger over losing his job, losing land, and being left behind in an Appalachia with no opportunities. He believed the system no longer had room for hands-on workers, so he created his own resources. This reinforced the investigation team's view that Hanlon's motive was not purely economic like stealing cargo but also deeply rooted in distorted psychology, where torturing and controlling others became his way of proving his own existence. Hanlon's statement in the interrogation painted a contradictory picture. He admitted to the pattern of cargo theft, abduction, forced labor, and skin carving for victim control, but denied murder despite forensic traces and victim accounts pointing otherwise. However, the very things he tried to conceal or speak around only strengthened the case file regarding a motive that combined economic factors with a deviant need for absolute control over people he viewed as personal property. The forensic analysis process following Roy Rustler Hanlon's arrest quickly formed a tightly structured indictment file, beginning with the comparison of fingerprints recovered from the restraint chair in the holding area inside the chamber of Belfry Mine 22. When the technical team used magnetic powder and green light scanning to highlight overlapping latent prints, they discovered a clear fingerprint on the metal bar behind the chair's backrest, located in the area that the person binding the victim would have had to touch while tightening the ropes. This fingerprint was compared to the sample taken from Hanlon at the time of his arrest and matched at 12 characteristic points, meeting the legal standard to be considered authentic evidence of his presence in the holding cell. When moving on to analyze the engraving knife recovered near one of the 3 holding chambers, the forensic team found 2 additional faint fingerprints on the knife handle, one clear enough to be identified as Hanlon's, further corroborating the victim's statement that he personally used this tool to carve letters into skin. DNA traces on the blade's surface were processed using a microsample extraction procedure, revealing the presence of human blood consistent with Jerome Walker's blood type and DNA profile as recorded in hospital results. Dried blood samples collected from the wooden walls and dirt floor in the second holding chamber were compared at the Pike County DNA Analysis Lab, showing 2 distinct genetic profiles, one matching Jerome and the other matching the DNA of the driver reported missing in 2016, Michael Dunford, who had already been identified through bone fragments recovered from the ash compartment. This proved Hanlon had held multiple victims at this location, despite his denials. In the central area of the tunnel, where the examination team discovered a trail of dripped blood forming a sequence, a third DNA sample appeared that did not belong to Jerome or Dunford, suggesting another victim, though within the scope of this section, it was only necessary to note that this DNA sample provided additional support for Hanlon's pattern of detaining multiple individuals. Additionally, when examining the dirt floor near the tool storage chamber, the forensic team found microskin fragments and soft tissue adhered in the grooves of a snapped zip tie segment. This soft tissue matched Jerome's DNA and included cut marks caused by a sharp surface, consistent with his account of being forcibly restrained, unrestrained, and sustaining injuries during forced labor. Continuing the comparison of shoe prints recovered at the scene with the shoes Hanlon was wearing at the time of arrest, the forensic lab noted that the sole tread pattern, wear on the outer heel edge, and coal sand adhering in a consistent swirling pattern matched the impressions on the dirt floor near chamber number 3 and along the tunnel corridor. Upon deeper analysis, the technical team observed that the grooves in Hanlon's shoes still retained coal dust, with mineral composition identical to samples collected from Jerome's clothing and from the coal storage area floor, linking Hanlon's movements directly to the crime space. This match demonstrated that he frequently moved through that mine, rather than just passing through as he claimed. The verification of the engraved markings on the 2016 victim's bones continued to reinforce the conclusion that the injury style was characteristic of Hanlon. When comparing the engraved lines, the expert team noted that each character had the same depth, width, and angled cut, consistent with the blade recovered from the Silverado. This knife had a small nick on the left leading edge, creating a distinctive scratch that appeared on several characters engraved on Dunford's bones. This level of match approached that of a criminal signature, allowing investigators to trace Hanlon's behavior without requiring direct admission from him. When analyzing the impounded Silverado, the forensic team uncovered further incriminating evidence. In the truck bed, numerous pieces of electrical wire, zip ties, and steel nails bore dried blood. The DNA matched Jerome's, proving he had been transported or injured inside the truck bed. Additionally, the undercarriage contained thick, compacted coal dust, identical to that from Belfry Mine 22, indicating the vehicle had not visited the site just once but multiple times. Investigators also compared images of the Silverado with cameras from at least 3 unsolved cargo theft scenes along the Appalachian corridor. Based on the distinctive teardrop-shaped rust streak on the right side, the misaligned mud flap, and the dimmer-than-normal left taillight, they confirmed Hanlon's vehicle appeared within range of all 3 incidents, creating a tight chain linking this vehicle to the thefts. The comprehensive forensic map compiled all the data from fingerprints, blood samples, DNA, shoe prints, engraved symbol structure, coal dust, and vehicle movements, forming a unified evidence file. In it, each discrete piece of evidence, the fingerprint on the restraint chair, dried blood in the holding chamber, engraving knife, shoe prints, 2016 victim's bones, and the repeated presence of the Silverado at crime scenes interconnected into a logical chain confirming that Roy Rustler Hanlon directly carried out the detention, torture, and assault of multiple truck drivers. Binding all the physical evidence into a complete forensic pattern created a solid legal foundation for the charges against Hanlon, refuting all of his denials or evasive arguments presented during interrogation. The federal trial in 2020 of Roy Rustler Hanlon took place at the United States Courthouse, where the prosecution presented a massive forensic file and the direct testimony of Jerome Walker before a 12-member jury selected through a rigorous screening process. Right from the opening session, the federal prosecutor displayed photographs of the confinement chambers in Belfry Mine 22, the blood-stained restraint chair, the letter-carving knife, and the evidence items recovered during the examination, then presented each forensic conclusion in a cold but precise rhythm, filling the courtroom with a thick heaviness. Opening the case for the prosecution, the attorney read aloud the fingerprint comparison results matching Hanlon to prints lifted from the restraint chair, then moved on to the chain of DNA evidence on the knife blade and blood samples on the wooden walls, all directly linked to victim Jerome. When Jerome was called to the stand, he appeared gaunt and tense-faced, but his voice remained steady as he recounted the moment he was approached at the Matewan Gas and Go station, the process of being anesthetized, and the entire sequence of months held captive in the darkness of the mine tunnels. His detailed descriptions of coal sacks, the sound of the knife carving into skin, and the terror of being buried alive in confined spaces left the entire courtroom in absolute silence. The prosecution asked Jerome to identify each piece of evidence, and he recognized the thin-bladed knife, zip ties, restraint chair, and wall-carved characters as matching exactly what he had endured. His testimony was reinforced by two expert witnesses, a specialist in patterns of forced labor confinement and a forensic psychologist who evaluates cyclical criminal behavior. They analyzed the structure of the mine tunnel spaces, the crude wooden chambers, the makeshift electrical wiring, and the physical psychological coercion methods Hanlon employed. The forced labor expert explained that these features fit the profile of prolonged captivity, where the perpetrator maintains control by alternating torture, spatial restriction, and high-intensity forced labor. When photographs of the carved characters on Jerome's skin were shown in court, the forensic expert analyzed the cut lines, depth, and edge traces, confirming they were made by the same thin-bladed tool and matched cut marks on victim Michael Dunford's bones. This helped the jury understand that the letter-carving behavior was not impulsive, but part of a repeated ritual of control used by Hanlon. The prosecution continued building its argument by presenting a compiled chart of camera data showing the rusty Silverado's appearances in 3 unsolved cargo thefts along the Appalachian route. The vehicle's consistent shape, paint wear, and travel paths created a strong chain linking Hanlon to the thefts. When the defense attorney tried to argue that Hanlon was merely a psychologically damaged Appalachian man, the prosecution swiftly countered by introducing Hanlon's prior history of violence, proving he was not suffering from uncontrollable mental illness, but was fully capable of planning, target surveillance, and sustaining an organized criminal pattern over many years. The prosecution questioned the court-appointed independent psychiatrist, who affirmed that Hanlon was fully competent to understand his actions and had no disorder reducing criminal responsibility. When asked about the killings related to the bone fragments found in the mine, Hanlon denied it but offered no evidence to refute the claims. The prosecution immediately presented electron microscope photographs of the cut marks on Dunford's bones, highlighting characteristic nicks from the knife Hanlon used. This forced the court to consider murder charges based on forensic indicators, even without a complete body. A bone trace expert testified before the jury, explaining that the carvings on the bones could only have occurred while soft tissue was still present, meaning they were not made by someone else after decomposition, thereby directly implicating Hanlon. The Silverado's repeated appearances at theft sites and its recovery with blood traces, coal dust, and matching items rendered the defense arguments ineffective. Investigators also presented a movement diagram of Hanlon based on recovered auxiliary GPS data from the vehicle, proving he had visited the mine multiple times during the same period the victim was held. When the defense requested the GPS evidence be excluded because Hanlon may not have known the device was still active, the prosecutor rebutted by pointing out that the device had been deliberately disconnected but not removed, showing Hanlon knew of its existence and attempted to conceal his travels in a non-thorough way. The jury was asked to consider all evidence in a unified structure: fingerprints on the restraint chair, DNA on the knife, blood in the confinement chambers, shoe prints at the scene, carvings on Dunford's bones, Jerome's testimony, camera images, and the Silverado's movement data. The prosecution concluded that all these pieces were not only independent, but mutually reinforcing, forming an ironclad foundation for conviction that could not be explained by any reasonable theory of innocence. When the jury returned to the courtroom after many hours of deliberation, silence enveloped the room. The presiding judge asked the jury foreperson to stand and read the verdict, and in front of Hanlon, the foreperson announced that the jury unanimously found the defendant guilty on all counts as charged by the prosecution, based on clear forensic evidence, the victim's direct testimony, and the proven systematic criminal pattern presented in court. The atmosphere inside the federal courtroom at the United States Courthouse grew thick with tension as the presiding judge entered and called for everyone to rise to begin the sentencing hearing for Roy Rustler Hanlon. He was escorted to the defendant's seat, flanked closely by 2 federal marshals on either side, his eyes vacant but his jaw clenched as the metal handcuffs locked with a faint clink that only those seated nearby could hear. The prosecution team and representatives of the victims' families were all present, including the parents of the driver reported missing in 2016, Michael Dunford, who sat motionless in the front row, their hands gripping tightly a sheet of paper containing the victim impact statement they had the right to read if the court permitted. The judge spent nearly 10 minutes reading aloud the full list of charges for which Hanlon had been found guilty, unlawful imprisonment, forced labor, torture, aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury, federal property robbery, interstate transportation with intent to commit crime, and charges related to the 2016 victim based on bone evidence with cut marks matching his weapon. Each charge was read with the corresponding maximum penalty under the federal code. When addressing the assessment of dangerousness, the judge emphasized that Hanlon was not an individual acting on impulse but a perpetrator with a repeated, deliberate, organized criminal pattern and a clear intent to control others through extreme violence, thereby classifying him in the category of highly dangerous offenders requiring the most severe penalties to protect the community. When asked if he had any final words to present, Hanlon stared straight ahead, gave a slight shake of his head, and replied in a nearly emotionless voice that he had nothing to say. That cold detachment plunged the entire courtroom into a silence as heavy as stone. The judge struck the gavel once, imposing 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, applied to the ongoing offenses of detention, torture, and forced labor against Jerome Walker, and the charges related to the 2016 victim. Next, the judge struck the gavel a second time, imposing an additional 80 years in federal prison for the series of property robbery offenses, interstate transportation for criminal purposes, use of violent means to assault truck drivers, and intentional infliction of injury, with aggravating factors of torture. All sentences were to run consecutively, not concurrently, meaning the total punishment for Hanlon far exceeded the natural lifespan of any defendant. Once the sentence was fully pronounced, the representative from the Federal Bureau of Prisons submitted the inmate risk assessment report to the court. The report concluded that Hanlon exhibited a high dangerousness index, a history of extreme controlling behavior, and a repeated pattern of violence with clear targeting, therefore classifying him as a specially designated high-risk inmate requiring absolute segregated confinement from the general prison population. The court concurred with this assessment, ordering Hanlon's incarceration in a maximum security unit of the federal system, where inmates have no direct contact with others except correctional staff. The reason was explicitly stated in the judgment. Hanlon's control over victims extended beyond physical violence to structured, ritualistic psychological violence, creating a high risk of recidivism if he gained access to vulnerable individuals. When the judge permitted the Dunford family to speak, Michael's father stood with trembling hands, struggling to keep his voice from breaking. He said they had waited more than 4 years to know what happened to their son, and though finding the answer broke their hearts, at least they could finally end the endless days of uncertainty. Michael's mother bowed her head and wept as the judge affirmed that forensic evidence had proven the recovered bones belonged to her son, and the court officially recognized Dunford as a victim of severe violence in the case. Jerome Walker's family was also present, and as the sentence was read, they only gripped each other's hands more tightly, without loud sobs, but their red-rimmed eyes conveyed everything they had endured during more than a year of hopeless searching. The judge concluded that this sentence accurately reflected the degree of danger and brutality in the defendant's conduct, while sending a clear message that any pattern of torture, coercion, and exploitation targeting interstate truck drivers would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. In the final section of the judgment, the court formally confirmed that the Rustler case had been fully prosecuted and concluded at the federal level, with all related materials transferred to judicial archives and the Federal Bureau of Prisons for execution of sentence. Finally, the judge struck the gavel, declaring the hearing concluded. Roy Rustler Hanlon was escorted out of the courtroom flanked by the 2 federal marshals, his shadow gradually disappearing behind the closing security door, with its echoing metallic sound, affirming that his path to freedom had been permanently ended. After the trial concluded and Roy Rustler Hanlon was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 80 years in federal prison, Jerome Walker returned to civilian life in Charleston, in a state of partial liberation but still submerged in layers of unhealed trauma. The long-term psychological treatment process began with therapy sessions 3 times a week, where he had to work hard to confront memories that had been locked away during the entire 16 months of captivity. Small behaviors, flipping a light switch, closing the bathroom door, or hearing a large truck engine outside, still caused him to tense up in reflexive defense. Specialists noted progress, but it was slow. He gradually slept longer, though he still woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air. Group therapy sessions with veterans who had experienced wartime captivity helped him feel less isolated, because they understood the invisible panic he couldn't put into words. The emotional support from the Charleston community became the biggest anchor in his recovery process, especially when a group of volunteers organized fundraising to help him cover the cost of long-term treatment. On the family side, relationships had been severely damaged during the time he suddenly went missing. His daughter, Morgan, who was only 11 at the time, had gone through a long period of confusion and fear, creating significant emotional distance when Jerome returned. At first, Morgan was afraid to get close to him because of the scars on his arms and chest, but over time, with patience and family therapy sessions, she began to open up, asking small questions about his new life, and eventually, naturally holding his hand while walking together in Charleston Park. Jerome's ex-wife, though no longer living with him, proactively helped him stabilize his daily routine and supported Morgan in adjusting to her father's return. Their relationship never returned to what it had been before, but mutual respect and understanding became the new foundation that helped Jerome feel he wasn't stepping into post-trauma life alone. Prolonged trauma imposed many limitations on his career. Jerome had once been an experienced long-haul driver familiar with the Appalachian mountain roads, but now just hearing the sound of a large truck engine was enough to make him break into a cold sweat. He tried returning to short city runs, but the very first trip caused him to panic when the truck passed through a small tunnel near Elk River. The doctor's conclusion was that he was no longer suitable for long-haul driving, at least for many years. As a result, Jerome switched to part-time work at a tool repair shop, where he didn't have to travel far and always had people around. The shop owner, a member of the Charleston community, offered him the job with the reasoning that you need a place to feel useful without memories dragging you back into the darkness of the mine. This light-duty work helped Jerome maintain a steady daily rhythm without confronting panic triggers. In community life, Jerome received broad support from local organizations. Some residents who had participated in the search for him in 2018 saw his return as a reminder of the responsibility to protect one another in the Appalachian community. Many truck drivers in the area raised funds to support Jerome's family, and another group organized safety talks for long-haul drivers, using his story as an example of the vigilance needed when facing help requests from strangers in areas without surveillance cameras. Because of this, Jerome was both enveloped by the community and felt that his story carried preventive meaning for others. The Rustler case left a major impact on the transportation industry throughout Appalachia. After the incident became widely publicized, many trucking companies updated safety protocols, requiring drivers to report their location every 30 minutes when stopped in remote areas, and implementing integrated emergency alert systems in cabs to guard against sudden abductions. Some gas stations, like Matewan Gas & Go, upgraded to high-resolution cameras and installed powerful floodlights in nighttime parking lots. Law enforcement in West Virginia and Kentucky coordinated more closely to patrol low-traffic mountain routes. Jerome rarely participated in public events on transportation safety improvements because it forced him to relive unwanted memories, but he understood that his survival had driven a series of important changes. Although the healing process was slow, Jerome gradually learned to build a new life. He spent more time with his daughter, focusing on small activities like cooking dinner, fixing up Morgan's bedroom, or practicing piano together. Those peaceful moments became proof that he had not been permanently buried by the Appalachian Valley. Though he still carried physical and emotional scars from the 16 months of captivity, he began to find a sense of safety in the gentle rhythm of life in Charleston, and the community's support helped him stand firm without bearing the fear alone. The story of Jerome Walker is not just a survival journey from 16 months of captivity in an abandoned Appalachian mine tunnel. It reflects very real issues in contemporary American life, from workplace safety, long-haul transportation security, to mental health and the role of community. What stands out is that the dangers Jerome faced did not come from some invisible force, but from conditions already existing in society. Surveillance gaps in rural areas, poorly protected long-distance transport routes, and the constant isolation of those who make their living as long-haul drivers. The first lesson comes from the moment Jerome was deceived by the dead truck scenario, showing that Americans today, even with generous hearts, need to balance helping others with self-protection. High-mobility occupations, especially long-haul driving, require risk assessment skills, emergency signaling systems, and the habit of continuous location reporting. The second lesson comes from Jerome's recovery process. Mental health cannot be taken lightly. His PTSD, triggered simply by the sound of metal or confined spaces, reminds us that trauma can linger far longer than physical wounds. Americans today, especially veterans, long-haul drivers, and workers in hazardous environments, need early access to psychological therapy without it being viewed as a sign of weakness. The final lesson comes from the Charleston community: the power of solidarity. Jerome could only begin a new life because those around him did not leave him alone. In a vast country like the United States, where many people fight silent battles, the best thing we can do for one another is presence, listening, and creating a safe environment so survivors can truly continue living. If you find Jerome's survival journey meaningful, please hit subscribe so we can continue exploring these powerful, cautionary real-life stories together. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we keep telling the stories that must never be allowed to fade into oblivion.